You wake up, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. You shape up your afro, kiss your beautiful wife, and say good morning to your kids. You check your phone to see the news. You notice many of your fans have been calling you washed, a has-been, not as good as you used to be. This makes you mad and motivated to prove them wrong. In turn, you prepare to destroy this tatted-up man with too much hype. You are Gilbert Burns, and this is the Casual's Guide to Gilbert Burns versus Sean Brady. Like and subscribe. First, we will be breaking down the career of Sean Brady. He was one of the biggest prospects in his division, but he got humbled and exposed. Now he is on a mission to prove not only to the UFC, but prove to the fans that he is ranked for a reason. A young Sean Brady started his life in Philadelphia, aspiring to become an auto mechanic. However, his hobbies consisted of training in Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, training at the widely acclaimed Renzo Gracie gym in Philly, eventually leading him down the path of mixed martial arts. And in 2013, Brady would have 3 amateur fights, winning all of them, leading to him making his professional debut in the promotion of Cage Fury, making his first walk in August of 2014 against Paul Almquist. Brady would win in spectacular fashion, destroying Paul by knocking him out in just 33 seconds into the first round. In May of 2015, Brady would face off with Jake Gombos. This would be a much harder fight for Brady, testing his cardio and his heart. But at the end of the day, Brady did just enough to get the win by unanimous decision. He would fight again in December of 2015, this time fighting Aaron Jeffrey. Much like his last fight, Brady would not find the finish, but he would still showcase his dominant wrestling and great cardio, winning by unanimous decision once again. Brady was building momentum, and he would stay active, fighting again just 2 months later in February of 2016, this time facing off with Rocky Edwards, the white Rocky Edwards. He once again would showcase to the fans that he is a legit fighter, destroying Edwards round after round, winning by unanimous decision again. Brady would take his time to recover and improve his skills, eventually fighting in August of that same year, this time fighting Chauncey Foxworth. He would break his decision streak by knocking out Foxworth just 57 seconds into the first round with a crazy spinning back fist. After that huge knockout win, Brady would be in the main event for the first time in his career, as well as fighting for the vacant welterweight title, this time fighting Tanner Serracano in May of 2017. Brady would make short work of his opponent, sinking in a nasty guillotine choke. Brady was on cloud 9 after getting back-to-back first-round finishes, as well as getting the belt wrapped around his waist. Brady would attempt to defend his belt for the first time in August of 2017, fighting Mike Jones. This wouldn't be a first-round finish, but he would still sink in a rear naked choke in the second round. After getting a successful title defense, Brady would switch promotions to a lesser-known show called Shogun Fights. His opponent would be Colton Smith. Although Brady's finishing streak would end here, he would still dominate his opponent, winning by unanimous decision. But Brady didn't like Shogun Fights enough to fight there again, so he would hop over to yet another promotion that is much more popular, the LFA. He would be the headliner of his LFA debut, fighting a future UFC fighter, Gilbert Burns. This was a classic matchup, with it being a wrestler versus Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specialist, and the winner would be the wrestler Sean Brady, beating Gilbert by unanimous decision. Brady would jump promotions yet again, going back to Cage Fury fighting championships, and he would fight Tajuddin Abdul Hakim. Brady would beat Abdul Hakim by knockout in the 4th round. Brady was looking unstoppable, and was considered to be one of the best fighters outside of the UFC, and they would sign Brady. And in October of 2019, Brady would make his UFC debut fighting a fan favorite, Court McGee. This was another classic matchup, being a wrestler versus striker. And much like his previous fights, the wrestler would dominate, beating Court McGee by unanimous decision. Brady was hyped up after his UFC debut, and would waste no time in fighting again in February of 2020. This time his opponent would be Ismail Nardaev. This would be a tougher fight, but not tough enough to beat Sean Brady. He would win in classic Brady fashion, a unanimous decision. Fight again in August of that same year, this time facing off with Christian Aguilera. This would be a walk in the park for Brady because he would sink in a devastating guillotine choke and force the tap just 1 minute into the second round. After getting his first finish in the UFC, he would face off with a much tougher opponent who would challenge him more than any other fighter has to this point, Jake Matthews. This would turn out to be a tough and gritty fight for Brady, but in the third round, Brady would sink in a nasty arm triangle choke and get his second finish in the UFC. This would turn out to be more than enough to get Brady pushed. His next opponent would be Ultimate Fighter alumni, veteran, and commentator Michael Chiesa. This would turn out to be a walk in the park for Brady. However, he wouldn't be able to finish over the crafty veteran, but he would win all 3 rounds and secure the unanimous decision win. After getting a big name under his belt, Brady would fight the current welterweight champion, Belal Muhammad. People were saying that Brady would destroy Belal and expose him not only on the ground, but on the feet as well. But once the ref said fight, it was the other way around. Belal would shock the entire UFC fanbase and knock out Brady with a devastating punch, with just 13 seconds left in the round. Not only was this his first loss, but he got knocked out. This would be a rough time for Brady. He needed to do some soul searching and level up his striking and his MMA game all around. He would take the next year to do just that, fighting again in December of 2023, this time facing off with a fan favorite and Ultimate Fighter Season 17 winner, Kelvin Gastelum. Brady would want to prove to the fans that he is still legit, and Kelvin was the perfect opponent to do so. And Brady would do just that by sinking in a nasty Kimura in the third round, once again forcing the tap and getting the finish over the legend. And that brings us to this weekend. Brady is going to fight one of the toughest fighters in the division, Gilbert Burns. Sean Brady is now entering his physical prime, being 31 years old, and he stands at 5'9". He has 16 wins, 3 wins by knockout, 5 submission wins, and 8 decision wins, leaving him with a 50% finishing rate. His only loss has been by knockout, and that was by the current champion. Now, it is finally time to break down the career of Gilbert Burns. Gilbert is at the latter end of his career, with him being 38 years old and standing at 5'10", but he still is no walk in the park for anybody. He trains out of Kill Cliff, which is a very good gym, home to many talented UFC fighters. Gilbert started his career jumping right into the pros, making his professional debut in January of 2012, fighting Jose Salgado. And his high-level jiu-jitsu would be shown in its best form by submitting Jose just 2 minutes into the first round. Burns would waste no time fighting again in June. This time, his opponent would be Hurls dos Santos, and once again he would show that his ground game is extremely high level, submitting dos Santos just 3 minutes into the first round. Gilbert would turn around and fight again just 1 month later in July of that same year. This time his opponent would be Vinicius Borrier. He would run through his opponent faster than ever before by submitting him with a classic rear naked choke just 1 minute into the first round. Burns was on a roll and seemingly couldn't be stopped, so he would fight 1 month later again, fighting Paulo Roberto. This would be a walk in the park because he would showcase the power in his hands, knocking his opponent out just 1 minute and 30 seconds into the first round. At this point, Burns had finished all 4 of his opponents in the first round, and was quickly becoming one of the biggest names outside of the UFC. He would fight again in March of 2013, this time fighting Rodolfo Rodriguez. This fight would turn out to be more of the same because Burns would sink in an armbar in the first round. Not wanting to slow down, he took another fight in 2013, this time facing off with Paulo da Silva. Burns would make it look like his opponent shouldn't have been in there with him, because he would knock out his opponent just 4 minutes into the first round. Burns would take another fight just a few months later in May of 2014, this time fighting Paulo Teixeira. And yet again, Burns would steamroll his opponent just 1 minute into the first round, with all of his fights getting finished in the first round. As well as a likable personality, the UFC would sign Gilbert Burns without a second thought. And just a month later after his previous fight, he would make the walk in the biggest promotion in the world. His opponent in his debut was Andreas Stahl. This wouldn't be like any of his other fights, being a back and forth scrap that Gilbert would end up winning by unanimous decision. After winning his UFC debut, Burns would fight a few months later in October of 2014, this time fighting Christos Giagos. This would be a tough matchup on paper, but once they started fighting, it was one-way traffic for Burns, because he would sink in a tight armbar 4 minutes into the first round. After securing his first finish in the UFC, he would slow his roll and fight again in March of 2015. He would fight a veteran in the sport, Alex Cowboy Oliveira. This would be a very tough fight for Gilbert, but he would catch Oliveira in an armbar with just 45 seconds left in the fight. After getting the finish in the last minute, he would move on to fight a Russian fighter, Rashid Magomedov. This would be a bad night in the office for Burns because he would get out-wrestled and outstruck, ultimately losing this fight by unanimous decision. This was Gilbert's first loss, but he still was only 10 wins with only 1 loss, so it was far from the end of the world. So Gilbert would take some time off to sharpen his tools and try to level up his game, eventually fighting again in July of 2016, facing off with Lucas Tajewski. Gilbert walked into the fight with a point to prove, and he would do just that by sinking in another armbar and forcing the tap in the very first round. Gilbert would fight again just a few months later in September of 2016, this time fighting Michael Prazeres. This would turn out to be a very hard fight, testing Gilbert in many ways, and he ended up falling short of getting the win, thereby losing the decision once again. Gilbert would take a whole year off to recover and improve. He would take his next fight in September of 2017, facing off with Jason Sago. Gilbert would come back with a vengeance, knocking Sago out cold in the second round, achieving his very first knockout win in the UFC. Gilbert would fight once again in April of 2018, facing off with Dan Moret. And once again, Gilbert would destroy his opponent by knocking him out just 1 minute into the second round. This would gain Gilbert a lot of hype, and he would get matched up with an up-and-coming Dan Hooker in July of 2018. This would turn out to be a brutal night for Gilbert because he would end up getting rocked bad with a knee up the middle and finished off with a barrage of follow-up punches. This would be his third loss, and the first time he had been finished. Gilbert was down on his luck, but he was still very motivated, and he would fight again at the end of the year in December of 2018, facing off with a very tough fighter who was good on the feet and great on the ground, Olivier Aubin Mercier. This would be a back and forth banger until the final bell would ring, leaving it up to the judges to pick the winner. The winner was Gilbert. Burns was back in the win column and would fight again in April of 2019, facing off with Mike Davis. Gilbert would run through Davis after getting a rear naked choke finish in the second round. Gilbert was on the cusp of gaining some momentum, so he would waste no time in fighting again in August of that same year, this time going up against Alexei Konchenko. This would be a tough fight that tested Gilbert once again, but he would pull away the longer the fight went on, eventually winning by unanimous decision. Gilbert has finally won 3 fights in a row, so he would waste no time in calling for another fight, and Gunnar Nelson would answer that call. Unsurprisingly, the veteran wouldn't be easy to put away, but he did more than enough to get the unanimous decision win. Gilbert was on fire, and to start off the new year, he would face off with one of the best jiu-jitsu practitioners in the sport, Damian Maia, and he would prove that he was way more well-rounded than Maia, knocking him out cold just 2 minutes into the fight. He was getting closer and closer to fighting for the belt, but he still needed to get a few more wins. So the UFC would have him fight a former welterweight champion, Tyron Woodley. This would be one-way traffic with Tyron being very hesitant to throw, ultimately leading to Gilbert easily getting the decision win. This would be a huge win for Gilbert because in February of 2021, he would fight one of his closest friends for the belt, Kamaru Usman. This was a huge fight for Gilbert. And in the beginning of the fight, Gilbert dropped Usman with a crazy fast hook, but Usman recovered quickly, and Gilbert would chase the finish too heavily. And in the third round, he got caught with a very powerful punch by Usman, leading to a knockout loss. Usman and Gilbert showed a lot of respect, and Usman showed humility, admitting how bad he felt for knocking his friend out and being the reason he fell short of achieving his dream of becoming champion. But this is the sport of MMA, the thrill and the agony at its finest. Gilbert would rebound from this loss with a ton of new fans. Although he lost, he showed a huge audience that he was a problem for most of the fighters in the roster. And in July of that same year, he would face off with a fan favorite and legend of the sport, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. This wouldn't be the most exciting fight, but Gilbert reminded the fans that he is an extremely high-level grappler, as well as a great striker, leading him to beating Thompson by unanimous decision. There was one of the biggest prospects waiting in the shadows, a fighter getting fast-tracked to the title, Khamzat Chimaev. A ton of people thought Chimaev would run through Gilbert like he had done to all of his previous opponents. This was far from the case. This fight was an absolute barn burner. If you haven't seen this fight, watch it immediately. Both men would get dropped and almost finished, and it would end up going to the judges, awarding Chimaev with the unanimous decision win, which was controversial. A lot of fans thought Gilbert should have won, but a loss is a loss, and Gilbert still gained a ton of fans. So he would walk into his next fight with more eyes on him than ever, and his next opponent would be Neil Magny. This would turn out to be Gilbert's easiest fight in a long time, because he would sink in a very tight arm triangle in the first round. After getting back in the win column, he would fight another highly ranked fighter, and in April of 2023, Gilbert would fight another legend of the sport, Jorge Masvidal. This would be a huge fight between two dogs, and Gilbert would be the better dog that night, picking Jorge apart and getting the unanimous decision win. After getting back-to-back wins, he would fight just 1 month later in May, this time fighting current champion Belal Muhammad. This would be a bad night for Gilbert. He ended up losing by unanimous decision, but he would end up tearing his left shoulder and spraining his C4 and C5 vertebrae in his neck, leaving him out of commission for the next 10 months. But he would make his return in March of this year, going up against another up-and-comer, Jack Della Maddalena. This would be a very rough fight for Gilbert, getting hit with huge shots and getting rocked with an elbow, and getting knocked out with a knee. This would be the first time in Gilbert's long career that he has lost 2 fights in a row. And that brings us to this weekend. Gilbert is fighting Sean Brady, and this is going to be a huge test for both men. Is Gilbert finally starting to decline, or does he still have enough gas in the tank to beat a younger and talented prospect in Sean Brady? Gilbert has a total of 22 wins with only 7 losses. He has 6 knockout wins, 9 submission wins, and 7 decision wins, leaving him with a 68% finishing rate when he wins. His 7 losses have been 3 losses by knockout and 4 decision losses. Overall, I'm picking Brady to get the win, but Gilbert is still very talented and has a great ground game. But all of this relies heavily on his explosiveness, which inevitably deteriorates the older you get. But some fighters hold on to that longer than others. If you watched the video this far, first off, thank you. If you want to support the channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, as it is the only way to show support. I hope you guys have a great week and enjoy the fights this weekend. Bye.